Welcome back, everybody. Obviously, as you can tell from this image, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is talking nonstop about Harry Potter and which house you obviously belong to. I'm going to pause a second to let that set in. Give you a chance to realize that I'm guessing all of you at some point in your life have determined that you're a part of one of these houses, and give us a chance to identify that a lot of this stuff that you might have done by going online and answering questions about these things or coming up with rules that you've devised over the years to put you in one of these groupings is at the essence of what we're going to be looking at today. And really, it's going to be our chance to kind of come full circle on this topic of personality psychology that we've been discussing over the last few lectures. What is it that we're going to be talking about then? What we're going to be looking at in this lecture is how researchers trying to understand those individual differences that we've been focusing on are able to assess this. If we want to simplify this, we're just going to look at this concept of testing personality and some of the strengths and weaknesses surrounding it. But before we get into some of the specific tests, I want to just give us the lay of the land of what researchers trying to understand personality tests have looked at over the years. One of the first things we want to cover when discussing these personality tests are some of the ways that people can be led astray when they are given tests like the one we alluded to in the very beginning, where you could potentially do something simple and figure out, say, which Harry Potter house group you're a part of. Or you could potentially be led astray on certain, I don't know, tests that your friends devise or newspaper articles that swear they can classify people in different groupings. A lot of this relates to something we're going to cover in the very beginning of this lecture called the Barnum effect. We'll also, after we talk about that, focus on some of the things that true researchers in personality studies want to focus on when trying to devise a really good way of assessing an individual. Well, then, after we've covered those big important concepts, transition to some different personality measures that have been devised over the years. We're going to start by looking at what's called objective personality measures, ones where they're very straightforward and are asking particular things to get at certain elements of personality. We'll talk about how they're designed and their strengths and weaknesses. And then we'll transition at the end of this lecture to talking about these things called projective personality measures. We'll also, in those, not only detail them, but discuss their strengths and weaknesses as well. And hopefully by the time we're done with this, we'll have a much clearer idea of not only how personality is tested, but some of the things that researchers focused on testing personality need to keep in mind. Well, let's start again with that Barnum effect that we talked about. For those of you that haven't heard about the Barnum effect, this is actually a very common concept that was around long before psychology. Something that's tied to a famous individual in our history named P.T. Barnum, even though the ideas he coined were definitely not unique and his own at the time. So let's say you read a story about yourself, or somebody wants to tell you something about yourself, or let's make it even more fun. Let's say I'm in your living room right now, talking directly to you, not everybody in the class, and I've come up with some ideas about you. I want you to just take a second and assess how accurate my statements I'm about to make are. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. And you have a great need for people to like and admire you. All these statements seem to have kind of an underlying theme in common. And they're all ones that bring out this thing that, again, we call the Barnum effect. What are the things that are in common with these what we call Barnum statements? Well, they're oftentimes vague and broad things that could relate to multiple aspects of our lives. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself, could relate to your academic performances, it could relate to your dating life, it could relate to your relationships with friends, it could relate to your, I don't know, creativity or artistic endeavors. Right? There's lots of things that that broad statement could be linked to. And that broadness is intentional in these Barnum statements. They're also usually filled with kind of an underlying positive theme. And you might notice here that these don't necessarily seem to have nothing but positive connotations, but at the heart of them is this assumption that you're a relatively good person. It's very common for most Barnum statements. And the last thing that's really critical for Barnum statements to work is, well, they have to be true for most people. Very few people, I'm guessing, if you were one of the ones imagining that I was talking directly to you, would probably refute any of these statements. That's another critical element to these Barnum statements. And if they are created in this way, they can start to produce this thing called the Barnum effect. So what is the Barnum effect? What's our tendency to accept these vague, broad, positive statements and link them to ourselves? It's a very common thing that has been used by charlatans, circus entertainers, and people that have argued they can read you by just looking at things like the stars or certain elements to you. And to better understand some of the early work on the Barnum effect that psychologists have done, I'm going to go through a video here, play us a video, hopefully, on these slides that highlights the work that not a psychologist per se, but a researcher, a journalist, ran to try to expose how this Barnum effect works. Hopefully none of you are too upset or offended by some of the things that you're about to see here.
Miller writes astrology columns for magazines and has a website that's viewed 800,000 times a month. What she gave me was a chart 22 pages long.
You have Jupiter in the 7th house, so you do very well with partners, people who collaborate with you to help you.
This is what's called a cold reading, when you say so much there's bound to be something in here that'll come true. And of course there's plenty of flattery.
You have Venus in the 10th house, making you a very popular leader or personality. Do you want me to go on?
In addition, they use warm reading techniques where they say things that are true for everyone.
Those 3 planets in Pisces makes you very intuitive.
Who doesn't want to think that they're intuitive? There's certain things you can say about people that most of us think are true just about us. Like, you have an above average sense of humor. Or, you're not living up to your full potential. This is silly. What you're saying about me, you could say about anybody. I'm an independent thinker, intuitive, thorough.
But to the
Lots of people believe this about themselves.
Yes, but I would give perhaps other people different adjectives to describe them.
To show how people fall for this, some years ago for Good Morning America, I had an astrologer do a chart on a mass murderer, Ed Kemper. Let me pass these out. Then I gave it to these students, telling them it was their horoscope. Charlotte Hunter? Would the mass murderer's horoscope capture their personality? You bet.
I love me.
Why are you laughing? Is it accurate?
Yes. I don't know if I was a believer or a non-believer. I was kind of like in the middle. But this is most of it is me.
How many feel that this came pretty close to capturing you? Okay, I hate to tell you this, but you all got the same horoscope.
Did we?
And I told them whose horoscope it really was. He's a mass murderer.
I'm glad I didn't tell anybody about this.
All right. Now, this effect that you saw in that video is obviously not an isolated incident. And it's one of the things that many personality researchers want to try to avoid when they're trying to come up with tests that we can devise to compare individuals. But there's other things that we have to concern ourselves with as well. One of the pairs of things that you'll see in a lot of research, not just in personality psychology, is the need for tests that we're devising, research that we're coming up with, to have two major components within it, what we call reliability and validity of the measures that we're using. You might have heard these terms before. Validity deals with whether or not what we're measuring is actually getting at what we're touting it to measure. Reliability is about the consistency in those measurements. I'm asking about validity. I'm saying, look, if I'm measuring your anger, am I actually getting at your anger through the questionnaire or, I don't know, biological measure or emotional measure that I say I'm coming up with? If I'm talking about reliability, I'm saying, are you consistently going to give me a score over and over again in a replicable situation on this new measure that I've devised? Now, we hope to have both, but sometimes we might just find one in the measure that we devise. In some situations, we might have something that's very reliable, giving us a consistent score from a person over and over again, and unfortunately, that score is sort of missing the mark. I might say, be able to measure your levels of anxiety by measuring your foot size. And I can consistently find over and over again that your foot size is not changing at all, providing me with a very reliable measure every single time for you. But my guess is that that's not necessarily getting at what your anxiety levels are. I have a reliable measure, but one that's not necessarily valid. I could also potentially have something that seems valid on the surface, but maybe isn't very reliable at all. This is an issue that we're going to talk about a little bit later when we get to those projective techniques that many people started to embrace a number of decades ago. I guess this is sort of a misnomer statement here because really it's impossible to have something that's valid, even if it's not reliable. I guess we could say it has the idea of being valid, even though it's not reliable. And then, of course, you've got those situations where you have no validity and no reliability, where nothing's even close to hitting the mark, and it's, of course, all over the place as it's nowhere close to even hitting the mark. Lastly, we've got these situations that we're aiming for as researchers, where we can devise measures that have both reliability and validity to them. This is what most people in personality psychologists strive for today. Not only avoid that Barnum effect that we talked about earlier, but to come up with a test that's giving us consistent scores on some measure that we're interested in, and ones that seem to be reflective of what we're touting them to be measuring. Another thing that we really stress in research on personality these days is to have scores that can allow us to compare individuals. Historically, many early personality tests, and we'll revisit this later, tended to try to clump people together into different groups. You were either type A or type B, or you had some grouping that we wanted to cluster you in and look at how that caused you to behave differently in different situations. Most of our personality researchers these days suggest that we should, if we want to really use personality measures to their fullest, not put people into groupings, but instead talk about people's deviations from the average. We can look at not, whether or not you're a very motivated or unmotivated person, but your overall level of motivation with some specific idea in mind. Of course, to do this, to standardize things, we have to take large samples of individuals on this specific measure that we've devised and figure out the spread of responses that people can give. But if we have it, we have a much more powerful predictive tool at our disposal that we can use for a multitude of different purposes. So what are some of these personality measures that do hit the mark? More often than not, what we tend to focus our attention on, especially when talking about very successful personality measures, are these things that we call objective personality tests. These were the ones I mentioned earlier. More straightforward ones that are simply asking you about yourself so, well, we can better understand how those elements to you can help us better predict what you're going to do in specific situations or certain outcomes relating to your life. Or potentially we could just try to figure out where these consistencies are coming from in the first place. And if we're looking at the most common one out there, the one that's used a ton by researchers, it's none other than the one that we discussed in our previous lecture, the trait measures of the Big Five. For those of you interested in figuring out where you are on the Big Five through one of our more established tests run, well, there's a link here that will direct you to a Berkeley researcher that's trying to understand where people are and give people a chance to kind of correlate themselves with their friends, or maybe compare themselves with their friends amongst the Big Five traits. If you'd like to, you can just click on the link or scan the URL that you see presented in front of you. But for those of you that don't want to quite do that, I do have an alternative option for you in the next couple slides. Just a reminder, when talking about the Big Five, what we're looking at are the 5 traits of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism. This is linked to something that we call the 5-factor model of personality, which was a term coined by 2 of the major researchers that helped develop the Big Five, Paul Costa and Robert McCrae. And the original 5-factor model of personality, the NEOPIR, actually contained many more questions than the ones that you saw the link to. It had 240 questions to it. And the reason for this was because it wasn't just measuring where you were on the Big Five, but it was measuring all the different facets within these and had multiple questions relating to each of the facets. Because what it was trying to do, as I mentioned earlier, is not just put people into groupings on these 5 traits, but measure, in comparison to others, how high or low somebody was on these very standardized tests that have sampled, at this point, millions and millions of individuals from similar cohorts and groups and, well, multiple dynamics that might be a part of your own life. If we want to review what the facets are to the Big Five, I provided them here in this slide. What you see is that for extroversion, it's not just about how much you like being around others, but it could be things like how assertive you are, how friendly you are, how much you like to do active things with individuals, how cheerful you are overall. Agreeableness, which again sometimes overlaps a little bit with extroversion, relates to how moral you are, how much sympathy or empathy you feel towards other individuals. Neuroticism, another one I want to highlight, has lots of different kind of mental reactions to stress that might be prevalent within us. Some might go towards anger, others towards depression, others for some type of self-consciousness where they're worrying about themselves a lot. All of these different facets within these Big Five should have some degree of overlap to them, but when we use the NEOPIR, the one again that has over 240, well, actually exactly 240 questions within it, what we theoretically are able to do is measure people's overall levels on these 5 traits, but measure exactly where they are on the specific facets, finding sometimes that people have upticks in certain elements of these facets that might be more useful in predicting certain things that we want to look at with respect to this Big Five traits, or these Big Five traits. So I mentioned earlier that if that survey that you wanted to look at before was a little too daunting to click on a link for, and you didn't feel like answering a 240 question survey about yourself, I'd have some alternative for you that you could go through very quickly and get a rough sense on where you are in the Big Five. Not necessarily break down where you are on the facets, but give you a ballpark as to how high or low you are on the 5 different traits of the Big Five. So to do this, we're going to use something called the TIPI, or the 10-item personality inventory. It gets at the big five, just in a very simplified version. So all you need to do to fill out this tippy is just rate rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 7 for these 10 different items. So, do you see yourself as extroverted / enthusiastic? 1 if you strongly disagree, 4 if you neither agree nor disagree, or 7 if you really strongly agree with that statement. Work your way down through all 10 of these. You might want to write this in a notebook somewhere, by pausing me and getting one out, because you're going to have to tabulate what your responses are on the next page. Now, if you've done what you were asked or instructed to do in the previous slide, what I want you to do is take those scores for the 10 different questions and do a little brief math. So if you want to see where you are on the extroversion scale, all you need to do is take your score from number 1 and add to it 8 minus your score from number 6. You're going to take that total and divide your answer by 2. Now please note that if you somehow magically got a negative number, your math was wrong. If you got a number that was greater than 7, your math was wrong. Heck, if you got a number that was less than 1, it was off. You should find a number when you do this math that ranges somewhere between 1 and 7, with you potentially landing on a half point. This is true for all 5 of the different traits if you do the math correctly. And again, the tippy's not a very precise thing, but it's been such a widely distributed test that we can, just for comparison's sakes, see where you are based on some of the more commonly studied things that I've been really comfortable having people compared on these days. If we look at some of the more commonly looked at things the tippy has studied over the years, it's comparing people across gender and comparing people across ethnicities. I'm not a huge fan of this, but it's oftentimes tough to find standards that don't have these specific breakdowns included. If you're not a big fan of breaking yourself out by ethnicity and gender, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can find the averages for all individuals being measured on these 5 different traits. E being extroversion, A being agreeableness, C being conscientiousness, ES being neuroticism or emotional stability, and O being openness to experience. Now, I want to point out, when you do look at these scores, that you'll notice the averages on these are almost never at 4. Right? They're above average, and this is a key component to standardization of not only the TIPI, but also the NEOPIR. Very rarely, when we measure people on the Big Five, is the average at, well, what we would consider average. This is often considered a byproduct of some of our tendencies to put some type of emotional value on certain traits and tend to rate ourselves above average on pretty much everything. At least in the United States, we have this high proclivity for doing this. So for you to say you're actually above average in conscientiousness, you can't just be above 4. What you actually have to be is above 5.4 if you're comparing yourself to everybody in the population. And you're not even really above average on conscientiousness unless your number, based on the standard deviations here, is at around 6.7. You have to essentially say you're a 7 on conscientiousness for you to be really decently above average. And for us to really get at the key things that make somebody extremely conscientious, we have to even go beyond the TIPI. We have to use the NEOPIR and really get at all the subcategories and facets to talk about people that are, say, 2-3 standard deviations above the group. And this is, I have an inherent issue with a lot of these personality measures. But nonetheless, people are very insistent that when we get a person's measure, we can take these standardized scores that people provide and use them to predict things like who you're going to get along with as a roommate, whether or not you're going to like going to a specific activity, what your longevity is going to be based on some of the different combinations of factors that you have. And all of this has proven to be very valuable. It's important to note that these things are relatively new. PIR has only been around for a couple decades. We've been measuring personality long before that. So how have we done it? Well, one of the classic tests that we had for many, many generations was something called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It was actually an endeavor that was pursued not only by personality psychologists, very early ones, but clinical psychologists as well. And what it was designed to do was not only try to understand individual differences, but look for something called psychopathology, using it to look for mental health issues that people were struggling with. And it did this by asking people not questions on scales anymore, but instead 300 to 600, depending upon which test you were interested in looking at, true-false items. This is a pretty exhaustive test, if you're wondering. And it's got lots of redundancies within it because it's designed to try to get at certain things that clinicians at the time were very interested in measuring. It was devised what we call empirically, which means there was not a lot of theory and research behind it like we saw with the Big Five. Instead, it was devised by famous clinicians and others that wanted to come up with good questions that they thought could get at the heart of some of the elements of clinical and, personality characteristics that we really deemed important. It's considered by many to be a protected psychological instrument, which means I can't really give you the MMPI here in class. But what I want you to understand is that there's a lot of different things that go into it, and there's even some hidden, subtle stuff to check the validity of your responses. Little cues where if you answer true to something, and you really shouldn't because nobody should answer true to a certain question, we know you're probably not telling the truth. Or if you're giving wildly different responses just when a question is slightly worded differently, again, we might be questioning whether or not you're truly following through on all the questions. So what are some of the things that are measured in the MMPI-2? Just so you can see a couple of the clinical things that are examined, I included them here. These are outdated questions, so you don't have to worry about seeing them if you ever do take the MMPI. But what you can see from these things are some relatively random questions that are getting at sometimes some relatively random mental health issues. In fact, you might, when you see some of these, say, is this really a way to correctly measure where somebody is on these clinical scales? Well, this is a major issue that many personality researchers argue about the MMPI. There's lots of issues with how this particular test was designed. It's not only kind of a historical thing, but what we found is that this does not work very well when we go across groups. Essentially, the researchers devising the questions for this devised the questions for the samples that they were particularly interested in and didn't really care how much it worked for a whole slew of other individuals. Another big issue with these particular studies was there's a lot of overlaps between things that are considered discrete within these. What we tend to see is people going in with mental health issues tend to score really high on pretty much everything, even if they're not diagnosed with different clinical problems. And with personality characteristics, oddly enough, if you're high on one trait, you seem to be high on a lot of different traits, and if you're low on one, you seem to be low on a lot. It's like people are sort of just answering things based on their mood, and everything sort of falls into place. Maybe it's because of just the way the test is designed. Maybe it's because there's 300 to 600 questions that tend to lead people just down a path that starts to have an underlying theme emerge. The last big issue, and I've alluded to this a couple times, is that the questions on this test tend to be sort of outdated. There's lots of clinical terms that are introduced that don't even exist anymore. Hysteria, masculinity, femininity scales. These things are considered by many researchers on the topics to be outdated. And in fact, the schizophrenia questions that are asked are considered by many in the clinical field to be inaccurate ways of measuring whether or not somebody is diagnosable with this specific disorder, something we'll be talking about in a future class. So going back to just the heart of this, for our particular purposes, is probably not the best way to measure a person's personality. And this brings us to another not so good test that you've probably heard of many times before you came into this class, and in fact, something that's still celebrated in certain areas, something called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. You'll still see this particular test circulating in certain schools, and lots of workforces actually like to hire people and put people in groups based on this particular type indicator. It's an odd one because what it does is it asks you a series of questions, and then based on your response to these, puts you into different typing categories amongst 4 different traits. In this Myers-Briggs test, you're either an extrovert or an introvert. We don't measure you on a scale on this one. We're typing you as an E or an I. You're either sensing or you're intuitive. You can't be somewhere in the middle. You have to be forced into one of these groups. You're either thinking or feeling, and you're either judging or perceiving. Usually when people talk about themselves with the Myers-Briggs, they'll even run off just a random list of where they are on these 4 different things. And it has some intuitive value to it. There's been studies that have shown that, if you put the right combination of people together in, say, study groups or business programs, you can have a better than just random chance output from these individuals. But people who have looked at this from a much more scientific perspective have argued that this is a very limited tool. That being said, my guess is many of you want to now take this limited tool and see where you are on it. So as you can see here, there's another link here to take a brief version of the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory. And when you're done with it, and you get all excited about it, we'll talk about some of the limitations to it. So what are some issues with this Myers-Briggs Type Indicator? Why would you in your business class learn about this being the greatest thing in the world and then come into this personality class and find out that there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable with it? One of the biggest things personality psychologists hate about this is the fact that it does categorize people. This is just a no-no in current personality research. We have come to the conclusion that most of us operate on some type of continuum, on pretty much every aspect of who we are. There's lots of gray zones that people operate on, and not only personality, but we're going to talk about this later, in mental health as well. And the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator forces people into groups. It creates a situation where somebody could be just a smidge away from another person on some type, some measure that we're interested in, say maybe the extroversion-introversion example. But they're right next to, unfortunately, that cutoff, so these people that are barely a fraction of a point away from each other, and whatever indicator we're using, are brisked away into their own special sections, and they're treated as disparate people, even though in reality their overlaps are much greater than their differences. This is something that causes huge rifts in the data, and many people believe it makes the predictability of this model really, really low. Some have argued that maybe what we should be doing with this is just finding ways to measure people on these continuums, and in which case this test might have significantly more value in the personality realm. Sorry about that. I didn't realize we had the median split scoring thing there, and we got a little pause with the clicker. Another thing that's really problematic with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is it seems to be, limited in measuring all the different things that make us who we are. What we tend to see with this particular measure is that it's getting at certain things that maybe are very valuable for businesses or groups where we want to look at more about productivity than anything else. But it doesn't really get at numerous things that we want it to get at when we want to predict things beyond just how we might perform in the workforce or get along with specific individuals. This brings us back to that big 5. One of the biggest knocks on the Myers-Briggs often is, it's good, but it's really not the Big Five, kind of suggesting that its predictive value and its scope is extremely limited in comparison to the Big Five and other personality measures that have been devised over the years. And this brings us to our last set of personality measures that we're going to be discussing in today's lecture. These wonderfully celebrated, we'll just call it debated, techniques that we call projective techniques. What are projective techniques? Well, the general gist of these techniques is that people are said to be able to measure an individual's personality by giving them some vague, ambiguous thing that allows them to take their thoughts, and drives, and personality characteristics and project them onto those mediums. One of the big issues with most projective techniques is how we can actually quantify the projection that people are engaging in. More often than not, projective measures are so unbelievably ambiguous and tough to quantify that only very specially trained individuals are contended to be able to measure where somebody is on a specific characteristic based on the projective measures that they're administering. And to understand how ambiguous this is and challenging it is, I thought we'd start this lecture off with, well, the most hotly debated projective technique ever devised in psychology. You might have seen something like this before. Those of you who haven't, well, there's a pretty simple task. What I want you to do is look at this image and run down a list of things that you see. Granted, it's not an actual picture for those of you wondering. Technically, it's just an ink stain that's been folded in half. But I'm guessing most of you, when you saw this, saw something. It's like when you look up at the clouds in the sky, you see something. There's always some way to put things together into a theme, a story. And that's what this test is banking on. What is this test? Well, it's something called the Rorschach inkblot test, named primarily after the person that designed it, and then the fact that what the test does is it just takes blots of ink that are, again, folded in half on a piece of paper and asks people to give just their interpretations of these things. Now, these inkblot tests, for those of you wondering, are designed theoretically to measure components to you. So let's learn more about this inkblot test. Let's have a researcher, I guess, to explain what this Rorschach inkblot test is and how it potentially works.
Take a look at this image. What might this be? A frightening monster? Two friendly bears? Or something else entirely? For nearly a century, 10 inkblots like these have been used as what seems like an almost mystical personality test. Long kept confidential for psychologists and their patients, the mysterious images were said to draw out the workings of a person's mind. But what can inkblots really tell us? And how does this test work? Invented in the early 20th century by Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach, the Rorschach test is actually less about the specific things we see and more about our general approach to perception. As an amateur artist, Hermann was fascinated by how visual perception varies from person to person. He carried this interest to medical school, where he learned all our senses are deeply connected. He studied how our process of perception doesn't just register sensory inputs, but transforms them. And when he started working at a mental hospital in eastern Switzerland, he began designing a series of puzzling images to gain new insight into this enigmatic process. Using his inkblot paintings, Rorschach began quizzing hundreds of healthy subjects and psychiatric patients with the same question: what might this be? However, it wasn't what the test subjects saw that was most important to Rorschach, but rather how they approached the task. Which parts of the image did they focus on or ignore? Did they see the image moving? Did the color on some ink blots help them give better answers, or distract and overwhelm them? He developed a system to code people's responses, reducing the wide range of interpretations to a few manageable numbers. Now he had empirical measures to quantify all kinds of test takers: the creative and imaginative, the detail-oriented, the big-picture perceivers, and flexible participants able to adapt their approach. Some people would get stuck, offering the same answer for multiple blots. Others gave unusual and delightful descriptions. Responses were as varied as the ink blots, which offered different kinds of perceptual problems, some easier to interpret than others. But analyzing the test taker's overall approach yielded real insights into their psychology, and as Rorschach tested more and more people, patterns began to pile up. Healthy subjects with the same personalities often took remarkably similar approaches. Patients suffering from the same mental illnesses also performed similarly, making the test a reliable diagnostic tool. It could even diagnose some conditions difficult to pinpoint with other available methods. In 1921, Rorschach published his coding system alongside the 10 blots he felt gave the most nuanced picture of people's perceptual approach. Over the next several decades, the test became wildly popular in countries around the world. By the 1960s, it had been officially administered millions of times in the US alone. Unfortunately, less than a year after publishing the test, Hermann Rorschach had died suddenly. Without its inventor to keep it on track, the test he had methodically gathered so much data to support began to be used in all sorts of speculative ways. Researchers gave the test to Nazi war criminals, hoping to unlock the psychological roots of mass murder. Anthropologists showed the images to remote communities as a sort of universal personality test. Employers made prejudiced hiring decisions based on reductive decoding charts. As the test left clinics and entered popular culture, its reputation among medical professionals plummeted, and the blots began to fall out of clinical use. Today, the test is still controversial, and many people assume it has been disproven. But a massive 2013 review of all the existing Rorschach research showed that when administered properly, the test yields valid results, which can help diagnose mental illness or round out a patient's psychological profile. It's hardly a standalone key to the human mind. No test is, but its visual approach and lack of any single right answer continue to help psychologists paint a more nuanced picture of how people see the world, bringing us one step closer to understanding the patterns behind our perceptions. Keep exploring the inner workings of the mind with this playlist.
Alright, now as you see in that video, there's a lot of kind of sides on this topic of the Rorschach and its value. The video was obviously created by somebody that was a strong advocate for the utility of the Rorschach, even if it's in more isolated incidents. But what's important to note is that the Rorschach is not considered by many personality psychologists to be, well, a very valuable tool to look at day-to-day individual differences. Might have some utility in clinical psych, but if we're going to look at things that personality psychologists use in projective techniques, it's probably a different test that's been around for almost as long as the Rorschach, something called the thematic apperception test. This one's devised as the same projective approach, but one where there's a lot more straightforward components to the images that people are asked to describe. And these people are shown an image, then they're asked what's happening in this picture. They're then asked what led up to it, and then what followed. And just like the Rorschach, the TAT is one that's not just one image that people are shown, but a combination of different images that are designed specifically to get at specific desires and needs that people have. Things that are a little bit closer tied to personality characteristics that we've been discussing. This is, again, a test that's been around for an extremely long period of time, and If you're looking for somebody in personality psychology trying to devise a personality test that's using these projective techniques, this is probably the one you're going to encounter. There's other ones that are out there, just not ones that have been around quite as long, and ones that have at least some utility in personality psych. But before you get too excited about this one, also know that the predictive value of these things and the reliability of these measures are very low, and much like the Rorschachs, scoring these is really frustrating. It takes a lot of training to be able to do it, and the responses that people give in these are still so ambiguous that being able to pinpoint where somebody lies is highly open to interpretation and requires a lot of consistent training and kind of maintaining your perception and kind of means of scoring for them to really have much utility. This kind of weird random TAT test is where we're going to actually end this lecture. But I do want to kind of close out with some levity just because, well, we started with some levity. So I want you to think about which house you're in and whether or not that would be a good test to figure out if, say, you're going to make a new friend or a new date, or maybe you would use one of these tests that we've talked about. Think about the value of these. Think about what might be useful from them. And hopefully, when you're going through that journey, you might have a better sense of why this topic of how we test personality has been something that we've been really tinkering with in personality psychology for decades at this point. And hopefully, after you've gone through it, if you've come up with some questions, you'll feel comfortable sending me them or looking them up, because there is a lot of really cool information when it comes to how we've tried to test personality over the years. But for this lecture, I think we've come to our end. So thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed everything, and, well, I hope to see you soon. Take care.